Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for joining One Neighborhood Builders for our monthly Fresh Fridays. I'm Allie Steinberg from One Neighborhood Builders. Um, if you'd like to turn on captions for this discussion, you can do so. First, click captions on the bottom of your screen. Um, And if you don't see captions, you can click more or the three dots icon on the bottom of your screen and select captions. Then you can choose your caption language and then click show captions. And my colleague Bailey put the instructions in the chat for how to do that. Awesome. Um, and Beautiful. And so we launched this Fresh Friday series to create space for practitioners, community members, policymakers, and all other interested people to learn and share about community development, especially topics that are deeply important to community development, which includes accessible and inclusive community engagement. Um, so today we will consider how community engagement can be designed to be more accessible and inclusive, especially considering disability justice and language justice. We are excited to have a panel of individuals with lived and professional experiences and passion for this work. So before we get started, just a few quick notes on logistics for the day. First, please note we will be recording this session as we intend to share it with interested individuals who are not able to join this morning. Second, if you have questions or comments while one of our panelists is speaking, please feel free to leave it in the chat and we will try to incorporate it into the session. Towards the end of the session, we'll have open Q&A during which you'll have the floor to ask your own questions. Third, we want to remind you that this is a space for learning and we encourage you to use it as such. So if you hear a question or a phrase or an acronym in the chat during the discussion, please ask about it in the chat and we'll try to address it. Um, and fourth, please take a second to introduce yourself in the chat. All right. Beautiful. So today we're going to hear from some incredible panelists who are advancing work on creating more accessible and inclusive spaces in Rhode Island. Stephanie Kaufman Timkulu is the founder and director of Project Let's, a national grassroots organization led by and for folks with lived experience of mental illness and madness, disability, trauma, and neurodivergence. Quentin Foster is the transgender whole healthcare director of the East Bay Community Action Program, or EBCAP, a health and human services organization for residents throughout Rhode Island's East Bay. And our own Eloy Rodas is the community organizer for One Central Providence here at One Neighborhood Builders. Eloy facilitates bilingual English and Spanish spaces for the Central Providence Opportunities Health Equity Zone Executive Committee. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Before we get started, I wanted to say that this is not and cannot be a comprehensive or perfect accessibility conversation. Everyone has different access needs. There are people beyond this panel and this virtual room who have important lived and professional experiences and insights on this topic. We also obviously will not cover everything in 45 minutes, or what we may discuss may not be applicable to the needs of your communities. As mentioned before, our goal is to create a space for learning. And this was certainly a learning experience for me and for our organization to create this discussion. And I'm so grateful to these panelists for their contributions. So now, thank you all for being here. And so let's transition to some discussion. I always think it's helpful when using terms, especially those that have become buzzwords, to start by defining them. So I'll ask everyone the same question to start. So when you think about accessibility and inclusion in community engagement, what are you thinking about? Quentin, let's start with you.
So there are a couple of points that this brings to mind for me. Firstly, that inclusion is more than just having the availability for a meeting like this to exist. Inclusion is much more purposeful than that. I think inclusivity is including not only being invited to the table, but also having your needs and your opinions valued, recognizing that we can't necessarily get everything perfect and having our community be open to continual efforts around improving things and making things better so that all people with all different types of needs can access whatever it is that we're trying to do collaboratively. For me personally, I think the two lenses that I bring to this conversation the most are around neuro-inclusivity, which is the inclusion of neurodivergent folks who have brain wirings that are a little bit different than the typical. This might be folks who have autism, ADHD, Tourette's, synesthesia, any of these entirely different perspectives that our brains might take, as well as those who have hearing loss or are deaf or hard of hearing. I fall into both of those categories, and those are some of the lived experiences that will continue to influence my answers as we continue discussing this.
Thank you so much, Quentin. Stephanie, same question. What are you thinking about when thinking about this topic?
Thank you so much. This is Stephanie speaking. I think one thing I'm thinking about is in a big picture way, the language we use around access, accessibility. I know some folks have or use language around universal accessibility. For myself, being situated within communities of disability justice, one term that I use is access centered. So being really intentional and specific about the ways that we are centering access. As Quentin was just saying, there are so many different disabled communities. And I think oftentimes it gets collapsed into the disabled community, and that there is this checklist of ways that we can achieve access. And our goal becomes very much okay, what are maybe the 5 things that we are doing to create access or to create inclusion? And these things, one, they're not things that we can actually create as organizations. These are things that we co-create in relationship with disabled folks. And I think that's particularly important because disabled people have historically and present day been situated as the passive recipients of services, not people who are leaders in our own rights, folks who are capable of making decisions either by ourselves or in community or in partnership with others. And thinking about the last piece, like we can have people in the room or in the space, and that does not mean that there is access or inclusion. And speaking as someone who I did my undergraduate time at Brown, and during that time, I developed a spinal infection and used wheelchairs, walkers, forearm crutches, and at a university with a lot of money in their endowment, and a lot of language around accessibility. There were many buildings on campus that I could not get into. I had to drop out of certain classes because they were in buildings that were labeled as historical buildings. And so they would not have access measures met. And so thinking about it's beyond who is in the room, it is so much deeper and nuanced. And this is something that yeah, I would encourage us to all think of as an approach and a lens and something that is lifelong work rather than how do we do this and then set it aside and like keep moving forward with the other work that we do. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for highlighting the systems that have been created and how they interact with what this topic is talking about. Aloy, same question for you. What are you thinking about?
So I will speak about my experience making spaces more accessible for non-English speakers and non-native English Spanish speakers. But I found that a lot of these has been is also possible to apply to when we have different age groups in a space, people from different backgrounds, even though they share all the language. But language accessibility isn't just about talking several languages. It's also about like ensuring that people are participating in meaningful ways. So there's also an aspect of cultural accessibility that is crucial Because even if you speak several languages fluently, you need to understand cultural context, things like habits, preferences, values. And obviously, you're not going to know all of those backgrounds, even if you speak the same language, even if you have the same native language. So you have to remain very curious and humble, ask a lot of questions, try to be the teacher and the student at all times. And as far as inclusion goes, obviously we're talking about how individuals need to, especially from underrepresented and marginalized groups, need to have a voice, but real inclusion also requires an investment in the community, so that people are not just involved in your programs, but are also in leadership positions, are also part of the decision-making processes, and things as basic as making sure that you're hosting a meeting in the neighborhood where the people you're trying to reach live in, or also simple things like designing a flyer and having in Spanish is great, but if you're not passing it through the organizations that serve Spanish speakers, you don't know the correct groups, whether it's a WhatsApp or Facebook or something else, or through churches, you're not going to really reach your audience. And you have to bit by bit learn the cultural biases or expectations of the demographics that you're trying to have a conversation with, and trying to build a community with. And for example, something that I think about is how people have been telling me that they're having trouble distributing free water filters, because there's a lot of cultural biases in the Spanish speaking community of what is the catch? Nobody gives anything for free, but people are demanding the spaces and opportunities to get education and information and build community before they can properly trust you and be in connection with you.
Thank you so much, Eloy. That's such a good point about needing to build trust as part of this. It's not just about putting things in the language and the terms. It's about the kind of steps before you even get to the meeting. So thank you for that. Quentin, I want to ask you, when you're thinking about planning a meeting, what are you considering, or what have you seen people doing well when thinking about access and inclusion?
Yes, to jump off of Stephanie's excellent framework around this access-centered approach, I think that is really important to keep in mind when you're planning meetings or community outreach events or anything where you're trying to bring in folks that are not your immediate team. So keeping an access-centered approach for me means thinking about all of the different ways that folks are going to interact with this meeting. Firstly, can they get there? Is the group of folks that you're trying to engage able to physically make their way to whatever building you're going to be in or access the Zoom room that you're going to be in? Is it on a bus line? Is it physically accessible for those who use wheelchairs or other mobility supports, things like that? Then once they get there, are they able to participate? This means things like language interpretation, ASL interpretation, the ability for folks to use things like screen readers and braille readers and all of the mobility and accessibility supports that folks already have and already know how to use. Are they usable in our space? And are we providing the maximum supports that we possibly can to make sure that folks can absorb the information? And then can they participate actively? Not just can they sit there and receive the information that you're giving, but can they then participate back? Can they share their ideas? Are their values and ideas and concerns going to be addressed adequately? Are the other folks in the room even going to understand what they're talking about? So accessibility for me, especially when we think about meetings, is so much more than just this mobility checklist. Can my folks in wheelchairs physically get into the meeting? Awesome, I'm done. It is so much more of an approach of meeting the needs of the various people that you're talking about and understanding that these needs are super different person to person and may even change within the same person over time. So just keeping that flexibility in mind and doing our best to recognize that things have gotten better. It's not always going to be perfect. We can't always meet every single need every single time. But if we think historically, there have been some really significant improvements around accessibility in general over a very long course of history, but even just in the last few years. Some of the things that I've seen folks doing better recently include making sure that their participants have choices. Do I want to use the chat or do I want to share my thoughts verbally in a Zoom room? Making sure that folks have seating that works for them, not only using desks that have connected chairs, but having size inclusive seating and having mobility inclusive seating, making sure that you're in a space with gender neutral restrooms and accessible restrooms. All of these things are starting to be considered more frequently and in more spaces. And so I think we're definitely moving in the right direction. There's just a little bit of room for additional growth.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Quentin. There was so much in there that I know I'm going to continue to be thinking about. Stephanie, I know you touched on this a little bit, but when you're thinking about planning a meeting, what are you, or when you are planning a meeting, what are you considering, or what have you seen people doing well when thinking about access?
Thank you so much, Quentin, for everything you just shared. All the things so important. One thing I want to uplift is something you're hearing, right? There's so many different dimensions. So being clear and transparent around like these are the ways that we are practicing access, and these are the ways we're not. And I think that makes folks uncomfortable sometimes to be honest about what we're not doing. But for example, as somebody who was a mobility device user, I would rather know before I show up at a space that I can't get in because there's a flight of stairs. And then I can choose to do something else with my time. So it's giving people informed consent and as much information and clarity as we can about what we are practicing and what we're not practicing. And I would say same for COVID, which we are still in a pandemic, which is very significantly affecting disabled and immunocompromised communities. There are ways that we, as folks who are facilitating spaces, can incorporate that by modeling wearing masks, by bringing KN95 masks, by supplying folks with tests. This is something that we're doing at Project Let's. We're currently doing a peer mental health program with over 80 students in 02908 and 02909. And part of our process is making sure that there's always hand sanitizer in the room, that our folks have access to masks and tests, that they don't have to pay for those things. That's another part of this. Quentin uplifted, thinking about access beyond just directly disability. We're thinking about size, we're thinking about race, we're thinking about gender, we're thinking about money, because disabled people are strategically kept in poverty and are very oftentimes impacted by a lack of financial means to show up somewhere, to pay for transport, to pay for childcare. Childcare is a part of access. Making sure that parents and caregivers can continue to be part of community spaces is so, so important. A couple of other logistic things I would say, as a person who's neurodivergent, I know a lot of folks, when we get together, we like to like shove a lot of things and have these very full and like packed agendas, which is really not accessible for so many people. We want to be having breaks. We want to have agendas that give clarity around like, how long is this portion going to be? When is there going to be a break? So giving people information in multiple formats as well. Some people pick up information verbally, visually. So having handouts, having slides, sharing things verbally, all these different ways of making information available to folks is really important. And then I'd also just say not giving up entirely on online things, on hybrid structure. These things make it possible for so many folks to participate and be a part of our spaces. So it's a really important investment to keep moving forward. Yeah.
Yes. All of that. And I think there's definitely things that I think thinking about the perfectionism space and just the transparency and is what I'm hearing from all of you, and being honest ahead of time in what we're doing and not doing. That's really an important perspective. So now we're going to talk. I know we've been talking generally about meetings. I want to talk a little bit about public processes. I know we have some government folks in the room. and people who interact with government. So when we're thinking about public processes and thinking about public hearings, town halls, school board meetings, what would you like to see done differently? Aloy, can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah. So something I was thinking while I was listening to the other panelists is that when you make things accessible to people that are living with disabilities, you're also making it accessible to so many other people that don't consider themselves as living with disabilities. So there's no downside to rethinking how you're reaching people, because a lot of people are going to be like, oh, there's these options, there are these choices. Even though this is not a life or death thing for me, even though I could have done the meeting without it, actually I want to use this ways to interact that I didn't know were available to me before. And I think specifically as far as public processes go, there's a lot of talking about how to get more residents navigating the legislative session, participating in like learning how to testify, how to write a speech, how to get, but also how to get the transportation and the childcare they need to do that. And for example, I know that we need to take a step back and rethink the processes that have the barriers that have appeared in these processes that prevent people from participating. We used to be able to testify via Zoom, and that was taken away. And that doesn't just affect people with disabilities, but also affects people that have multiple jobs, that have different hours of work, that have to take care of their families. And so we also need to make sure that if we don't are not getting the engagement of the community that we're trying to reach, it's because sometimes the initiative is not relatable or grounded in their day-to-day struggles, and they don't understand how this policy priorities that we're pushing, or this program or this event that we're inviting them to, are related to their chores, to their personal goals, to their families.
Yeah, really good points. Thank you so much, Aloy. Quentin, can you talk to us a bit about what you're thinking about with this and kind of grounding us a little bit in the history of disability rights in public spaces and public interacting with public processes?
Absolutely. So, one of the things that I always like to bring into this conversation is the history of the way that disabled people have been treated in the United States. It is really complicated, and like most minoritized groups, we have a complex and fraught history. Um, the disability community has been marginalized really significantly for most of the existence of the United States. But one of the things that I really like to bring in for folks to learn more about the history of the disability rights movement is this really awesome Netflix documentary called Crip Camp. If you've never seen it, I highly, highly recommend it. The full movie is available on YouTube, so I just put that in the chat if you're interested in watching. But it goes over kind of the history of the disability rights movements because it was grassroots. Most of this movement came from disabled people working for disabled access, which is incredible. One of the organizations that was kind of in the midst of this, doing a lot of the great work, is called ADAPT. And one of their major things that they are known for is back before public transit was accessible for mobility, you didn't have any of those wheelchair lifts that came out of public transit way back in the day. You just had to climb on. And obviously, that doesn't work for folks who use wheelchairs. And so ADAPT created this grassroots movement where folks literally chained their wheelchairs to public buses as a protest against the inaccessibility of public transit. They were also part of the crawl on Washington. If you've ever seen the photos of young folks crawling up the stairs at the National Monument in Washington, that was a disability rights protest as well, talking about how completely inaccessible a lot of our physical public spaces are. And at that time, if you were interested in visiting these places as a person with a mobility challenge, you were unable to participate because it's just a gigantic wall of stairs. So I do like to bring in those things just to center us in the fact that we have gotten so far when it comes to disability rights. We've made incredible progress, and yet we still have this misunderstanding of our community where we are viewed as a monolith and seen to have extreme needs, whereas most of the time we just want to be included like every other human being. Um, we definitely have some room to grow still, but here in Rhode Island, we have decent level of access and quite a few organizations that are working towards increased access. So I highly recommend that documentary if you haven't seen it, and follow up with some of our local organizations like RAMP or Mass Adapt, who are still working for increased access.
Thank you so much, Quentin. So we've gotten some questions about how accessibility and is often sacrificed in community engagement efforts when there are resource constraints. I'm thinking like time and money is what I've heard. How would you respond to that? Stephanie, let's start with you.
Thanks for this question, Allie. Yeah, this definitely comes up a lot. And I tend to think about it in two buckets. I really like we live in a capitalist society where we have commodified every service. And so accessibility services are one of those things that cost money, which means that we have to be prioritizing that in our budget, the same way that we are prioritizing payroll or we're prioritizing other things that feel like really core and essential parts of our organization. Access has to be in there. And I think about that both for like folks in staff and people who are doing the work, and then also for having interpreters, making events accessible, everything that comes up in the way that we do work in the community. I often talk about it from the perspective of someone who is multiply disabled, who has the embodied experience of knowing that if the location for the meeting is not wheelchair accessible, I won't be able to be there. So in the planning process, that just becomes a non-negotiable. So if your team, if your leaders share certain lived experiences or have certain lived experiences, we can see how that affects things from the inside out, because certain things are not, they're not theoretical questions of, oh, could we or couldn't we? It's like, we have to do this. We have to figure out a way. Do we have to fundraise for it? Do we have to put in extra like work to apply for grants for this? Do we like build relationships with other people and go that way? Or and I have very often seen organizations with virtually no resources and no funding, grassroots orgs, better prioritizing and doing access work than very well-funded organizations. And that can also include like, hey, someone showed up to this event, like, can we run to a store and like get a piece of wood and like make a ramp? Like, how do we create access? And like, or I'll say also knowing when maybe we cancel an event. Maybe we said that this event was going to have certain access measures, something fell through, we can't meet that. We cancel, we reschedule. So I think there is a way in which access has been thought of as this like extra that is like added onto the real work. Like access is the real work, and should be just as important in our budgets as anything else. And if we can't do that, then we are really missing a critical piece of the work that's just important as everything else. Yeah.
Yes, so much there. And I think also how we're adapting in the moment and working on the fly. And when things don't pan out the way we plan, like how do we adjust? Someone that comes into the space that we didn't know they were coming, how can we make it accessible to them too? And I love all the resources being populated in the chat. I think it's great to see that so many folks beyond our panelists have these resources and know these resources too. And so this is, I think, what we wanted this space to be, this kind of sharing. So Aloy, I'm going to go to you to ask you about this question, and then we are going to open it up to Q&A in a couple minutes and after that. So Aloy?
So, yeah, I think that Stephanie made some great points about how it comes down to investment again, right? And it's not just the investing in the like prioritizing a part of the budget for to make sure that that is always your first concern and not an afterthought, but also on the bigger picture side, invest in, and for example, if you're investing in bilingual staff, maybe they don't have all the degrees or all the experience that you need, but if you have someone who already knows the cultural backgrounds of the people you're serving. If that this person already speaks languages, you can forego having to hire translators. You also can get creative with the different tools that are accessible online. I know that a lot of people have increasingly started to rely on tools online for translation, on AI to translate, which a lot of people demonize as something bad or disingenuous. I think it's a tool that we can definitely take advantage of as long as we're being smart about it, investigating as to how English and Spanish are different, how something that seems very understandable in English, when you translate it to Spanish through one of the becomes very jargony and technical. So understanding the Spanish, for example, is a much more descriptive language, while English likes to be much more condensed. And also grounding your events in like and the topics of those events or programs in people's daily concerns, because that way, and also volunteering at their and offering capacity to their own events, so that you're creating a network and exchange of work and volunteers where people feel that they can participate and they want to come forward and offer the support last minute of, oh, I can do interpretation, it doesn't matter, or I can translate this, because you've been doing that for them too in a different capacity. So it's always, you can definitely improvise when it's not so much a problem of resources, but of like last minute adjustments. If you've already been investing beforehand in the community, in the different, if you've been attentive to what people have been inviting you to, asking you help with. So it's always about taking a step back and building those connections a long time before, or starting them now if you want to see the results in a few months, a few years.
Thank you so much for that, Eloy. And I think, yeah, it's so much back work and like thinking about it, relationships, and grounding it in people is what I'm hearing from all of you, just really centering people. So for this final 13 minutes we have together, we will open it up to Q&A. So you are welcome to raise your hand or unmute yourself, or you can type it in the chat if you'd want. And if you can't figure out the raised hand function, that is fine. You can also just unmute yourself. We'll give it some time. Dominique.
Good morning, everyone. First, I just want to thank all of these really, really wonderful, amazing panelists. I've been learning so much, and I really just appreciate the work you all do. This is like a super technical question, so maybe, I'm not sure if the panelists know, or maybe somebody else in the audience will know, but just thinking about what I think it was Stephanie had said about, the fact that there's the connection between disability and poverty, and there are so many regulations on benefits and things like that. And I know something that we have struggled with is like making sure people are compensated for their time and their contributions to our initiatives in a way that doesn't like mess up anybody's benefits. And I don't know if anybody has figured out a good way to go about this. It's been something that I've been struggling with for like years.
Yeah, any of the panelists want to jump in?
Yeah, so I think one of the first things to consider with that question is what you're compensating the person for. I think there's going to be a significant difference between compensating someone for spending 30 minutes working on a survey with you versus having like a long-term, almost like you're hiring them, but not quite, kind of consulting role. Those are going to have very different compensation conversations. So I think just keeping that lens in mind that like it can be different depending on what it is that you're thinking about. And then having that conversation with that specific person, because every single person who receives disability benefits is going to be in a slightly different situation. Yes, the rules are all the same for all of us, but someone might, for example, really desperately need childcare versus someone else might really desperately need groceries. And so being able to have that conversation about what would be the most helpful for you in your real life in this one specific moment can be really helpful when you're trying to figure out how to compensate people without messing up their benefits.
Stephanie, I saw you said in the chat that you have dealt with this, if you want to share anything more on that.
Yes, appreciate what you shared, Quentin. We've gotten creative in all sorts of ways. I would just uplift Visa gift cards for things, as well as other people receiving compensation on behalf of. So having paying stipends for um in that regard. And then service exchange has been a huge part of that, and is so interconnected with having relationships, and yeah, being willing to get a little creative in how folks' needs are getting met.
Awesome. Thank you both. Derek.
Thank you, and I apologize if this has been addressed. I had a client call in the middle of the early part of the presentation, but on the issue of linguistic accessibility, one of the challenges I think that I've faced, my department has, a contract with an interpretation service, which is great when you can't do anything else. But obviously, when I'm able to work with our bilingual staff, it's communication is much more personalized and consistent and reliable. And I've been trying to improve my own dimly remembered high school and freshman year of college Spanish. And I know there are a lot of apps and things out there, but I wonder if anyone has any sort of local resources. I think it would be much more effective, learning and tutoring with actually local Spanish-speaking populations. So if anyone knows of any resources for that, I would be greatly appreciative.
If anyone wants to come off mute, I see Dominique put in the chat, which was what I was going to say as well. At the Onlyville Resilience Hub, the Coalition for Multilingual Rhode Island is doing a Spanish English language exchange, and they're open to doing other languages in the future too. So if you have suggestions, that's hosted by on Tuesday nights. I think it's from 6 to 7:30 p.m. for a few more weeks. And I think they're open to doing it in the future. I saw Quentin put in the chat an app for ASL, Lingvano. Costs money, but is worth it if you can afford it. Anyone else want to uplift any resources?
Yeah, I was gonna mention I don't have the name of the app, but I can certainly look it up and you can send it out. If you send when you send the recording of the along with all the other resources. But I recently talked with some volunteers who were door knocking to spread the word about the program, and neither of them spoke Spanish, and this app was basically just translating for them what they were saying, and then the person was saying it. And apparently this is not a long-term solution, but they apparently the interaction was very charming for the person who, the several Spanish speakers that they knocked the door on. They found it also like a very nice that it's them that is making the effort to try to be understood, as that is them that are being like, you're not the one that needs to understand us in English, so we're not gonna start like speaking very slowly and articulated in English, but rather we're the ones that are trying to communicate with you in Spanish with what few words we know. And apparently it went really well. So just like trying to like make it a game, make it like a like connect and get to know the other person can go a long way.
Thank you. And I know Quentin put in the chat a form, and I'll share out, as Eloy alluded to. I will send out the recording to everyone who registered today, and I'll send out all of these resources that have been shared in the chat. I know Quentin also shared a request form where you can request an ASL interpreter or CART, which is that live captioning. And so that's another resource for you to request interpretation. And yes, and in terms of Derek, I hope that answered your question. And are there any other questions? We have a couple minutes, 5 more minutes left. Or if someone wanted to answer part of that question too. Quentin also uplifted in the chat to enable captions on all Zoom meetings you host as an easy way to increase access. Windows 11 also has a live caption function for real-world connection. Awesome. One question I had, and someone can certainly feel free to drop in if you have another question. You can put in the chat, like, I have a question, or unmute. All of you touched on this a little bit, but access and inclusion certainly don't exist in in a vacuum and don't only relate to disability and language justice. How do you see this work as intersecting with advancing racial equity and other diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts? And whoever wants to jump in first certainly can.
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah, no, of course. How do you see this work as relating to advancing racial equity work and other diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts?
So I can start. I think Eloy made a really great point earlier that there is no downside to including the disability community. When you design things to benefit those that need the most support, folks who need less support also benefit, which is a really important thing. When we think about DEI in general, there are a lot of different minoritized and marginalized communities that we are trying to be more inclusive of. And accessibility that's designed for the disabled community can also benefit other groups that are not disabled. But also, I like to use a kind of hot button example to talk about this issue. One of the things that comes up really frequently for me now as an LGBT programmer is when I do community events, we have to have the conversation about police because there is a complicated relationship with police officers in a lot of marginalized communities. And at the same time, our world right now is highly, highly violent towards LGBTQ folks. So we have to balance making sure that myself as the presenter and all of the queer folks that show up for my programming are safe with the potential risk of re-traumatizing both the queer folks, but also the people of color and the disabled people and all of the other marginalized groups that have potentially difficult relationships with police officers. And so every single time we have an event, we have to have this conversation of the pros versus cons of having police presence, or maybe having them come and do a walkthrough beforehand, but not staying with uniforms and armed officers and all of that throughout the event. That's really complicated because sometimes what is the best for one group might be awful for another, or what's okay for one group isn't okay for another. So I think kind of focusing on the community that your particular event is there to support, while also keeping in mind that people have intersectional identities. You might be designing this event for the LGBTQ community, but that doesn't necessarily mean that a religious person won't show up, or a person that speaks a different language won't show up, or an immigrant won't show up. And there are other identities that we have to keep in mind for the folks that we are centering.
Thank you so much, Quentin. That's That's really, I really appreciate that and talking about what resources we have available and what resources we wish were available in terms of community safety. Stephanie, I know you had some thoughts on this if you want to share before we wrap up.
Yes, but also maybe we can hear, I would love to hear from everyone if you have thoughts as well, Lori. Yeah, I think I just want to be maybe like a slightly bit more explicit than Quentin was, and I really appreciate the way you laid that out. In terms of like having, when we're thinking about the intersections of disability with racial justice, in terms of like having a complicated relationship with police, I think that's fair. And also, I would like lift into the space that we know that at least 50% of people who are killed by police are disabled. When I'm doing my work in community mental health with people who are in psychiatric hospitals, people who are incarcerated, mental health and disability is always part of the equation. And racialized people are dealing with disability at extremely higher rates. So we're thinking about, in terms of that piece of it, how we respond maybe to safety, questions of safety, how we respond to something like a mental health crisis. And then I would say as well, thinking about how we become disabled matters, right? There are many people who come into disability through violence, through being located in a community that's near where nuclear waste is being dumped, or being located in an asthma valley, in an area where clean air is not prioritized, which is deeply connected to race and class. So thinking about all of these intersections, I think the resources that we turn to, what we call help, or what we think looks like or creates a safe container for folks in our community when we think about disability, is really important.
Thank you so much for uplifting all of that. I really appreciate all those intersections you raised. Before we wrap up, Aloy, I want you to have a chance to say on this too, and then we'll summarize what's next.
Yeah, pivoting a little bit away from the very interesting conversation we're having about the police presence and how it affects communities of color. I've also noticed that in a lot of meetings, are standing up in a room and starting to speak in Spanish and expecting someone to translate, and there was no beginning of the meeting said, oh, there's going to be Spanish interpreters here, or I can translate. They just stand up and start talking, and they, and that really goes to show that in some spaces people feel really safe. They feel really secure in the fact that at least other people in the room will understand them, because there's a high level of bilingual people, and they know they recognize their faces, or they know that they're there in the room, or they know that like this expectation that this has to be something that is expected and from every meeting, and it's not anymore about like, oh, can someone translate for me, or they just they're part of it, and they know that they need to that they're going to be heard regardless of whether the resources are there or not. So we need to move at the same pace as them in order to advance the racial equity in the spaces.
Thank you all so much. As I said at the beginning, there was no way we were going to cover all of this in 45 minutes. And so I hope this has been a little bit of something to get you going this Friday morning, things to look into deeper. I want to thank our panelists for their time, insight, and expertise this morning. I also want to thank all of you who uplifted things in your questions in the chat and took out of your time out of your Friday morning to join us. We hope you will consider joining us at a future Fresh Friday. We will be back with our next Fresh Friday on November 15th. If you are here today, you will receive an announcement about that next session. Please note that as you exit the Zoom meeting this morning, a brief survey about today's event will pop up in your browser. It will ask you for feedback on today's session. Please take a minute or two to respond. It helps us continue to provide an engaging, helpful, and accessible Fresh Friday in the future. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate you all, and I hope you have a great Friday.